I've spent 15 years investigating cases that keep me awake at night, but nothing prepared me for what I discovered about the Collins family. Sometimes the truth isn't buried in police files or witness testimonies. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight, waiting in the most ordinary places for someone brave enough to look. Sarah Collins was 34 when she died. I say died because that's what the evidence suggests, though officially she's still listed as missing. Her husband Mark was 37, a software engineer with calloused hands from weekend carpentry projects. Their children, Emma, 12, and little Tommy, 8, had been counting down the days to their Colorado camping trip for months. Mark had saved for 2 years to buy that RV, a modest 1998 Winnebago that Sarah had decorated with cheerful yellow curtains. The Collins family lived in suburban Denver, in one of those neighborhoods where everyone waves from their driveways and kids ride bikes until streetlights flicker on. Sarah worked part-time at the local library, always carrying the scent of old books and vanilla coffee. Mark coached Tommy's little league team every Tuesday. Emma was learning violin, though her practicing made the neighbors' dogs howl. They were the kind of family that appears in stock photos. Relentlessly normal, aggressively average, perfectly forgettable. But forgettable families don't just vanish into thin air. They don't leave behind crime scenes that make seasoned detectives request transfers. They don't create mysteries that spawn documentaries and true crime podcasts that reach millions of listeners worldwide. The Collins family did all of these things, and they did it without saying a single word. Their camping trip was supposed to last 5 days. Mark had researched the area for months, poring over maps and reading reviews on camping forums. He'd chosen Wildwood Creek Campground, 40 miles northwest of Aspen, because it promised seclusion without complete isolation. The campground had 12 sites scattered along a crystalline creek, each separated by thick stands of pine and aspen trees. In September 2001, when the leaves were turning gold and the air carried winter's first whisper, it must have seemed like paradise. I've walked those trails myself, felt the crunch of pine needles beneath my boots, breathed air so clean it almost hurts your lungs. There's something about that place that makes you understand why the Collins family chose it. The silence is complete. No traffic, no sirens, no reminder that civilization exists beyond the tree line. Just wind through branches and water over stones, and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. Mark had packed everything with military precision. He'd made lists, checked weather forecasts, even brought a satellite phone for emergencies. Sarah had organized the food into labeled containers, enough for 6 days to be safe. Emma had packed 3 books and her journal with the tiny lock. Tommy had insisted on bringing his collection of toy cars, each one carefully wrapped in tissue paper. They left Denver on Thursday morning, September 13th, 2001. The timing haunts me now, just 2 days after the world changed forever, when everyone was still reeling from tragedy and looking for something normal to hold on to. Maybe that's what they were seeking in those mountains, a return to simplicity, a reminder that some places remain untouched by human cruelty. The drive should have taken 3 hours. Mark called Sarah's sister Julie at 2:30 p.m. to report they'd arrived safely and set up camp at site number 7. Emma had already found tadpoles in the creek. Tommy was building a fort with fallen branches. Sarah was unpacking the carefully planned meals, humming something soft under her breath. Mark sounded relaxed, Julie would later tell investigators. Happy. There was nothing in his voice that suggested he had any idea what was coming. That phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with the Collins family. After 2:30 p.m. on September 13th, 2001, they might as well have been abducted by aliens. Their cell phones went silent. Their RV sat undisturbed. Their carefully planned vacation became the beginning of one of Colorado's most baffling, unsolved mysteries. What happened during those first 24 hours at Wildwood Creek? I've reconstructed their timeline based on physical evidence and witness statements, but the gaps are enormous. We know they set up camp properly. Tent stakes driven deep, camping chairs arranged around a fire ring, food stored in bear-proof containers exactly as regulations required. We know they ate dinner Wednesday night because investigators found dirty dishes in the RV's tiny sink. In Part 2, Entrance 23 characters. The last physical evidence of the Collins family's normal activities came from Emma's journal, found months later stuffed between RV cushions. Her final entry, dated September 13th, read, "Dad made the best campfire. Mum sang songs from when she was little. Tommy caught a frog but let it go because it looked scared. I can see 1,000,000 stars from my sleeping bag. Tomorrow we're going to hike to the waterfall." Sedunti. The handwriting was neat, careful, full of 12-year-old optimism. She had no idea she would never see tomorrow. I've spoken with every camper who was at Wildwood Creek that September. Most of them are older now, their memories faded by time and trauma, but certain details remain crystalline. Margaret Hensley, who was camping with her husband in Site 3, remembered hearing children's laughter around 8 p.m. on Thursday night. "Normal camping sounds," she told me. "Kids being kids, you know, nothing unusual." But James Morrison, a solo hiker staying in Site 12, heard something different around midnight. He woke to what he described as urgent talking. Adult voices, hushed but intense, coming from the direction of Site 7. He couldn't make out words, but the tone suggested disagreement or concern. Morrison is a light sleeper, trained by years of backcountry camping to wake at unusual sounds. He listened for maybe 10 minutes before the voices stopped and silence returned to the campground. That silence would stretch for 12 years. When Mark failed to call Julie on Friday as promised, she wasn't immediately concerned. Cell service in the mountains was spotty, and Mark had mentioned wanting to disconnect from the outside world. But by Saturday evening, when they were supposed to be driving home, Julie's worry transformed into panic. She called the campground office, then the county sheriff, then anyone who would listen. The search began Sunday morning with a team of 6 deputies and 2 search dogs. What they found at Site 7 defied explanation. The RV sat exactly where Mark had parked it, doors unlocked, windows slightly open for ventilation. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. Beds made, dishes clean, personal belongings neatly arranged. But closer inspection revealed disturbing details that suggested either careful preparation or complete chaos, depending on how you interpreted the evidence. All of the family's identification documents were missing. Wallets, driver's licenses, passports, social security cards, gone. But their credit cards and cash remained untouched in Mark's jacket pocket. Sarah's jewelry, including her grandmother's wedding ring, sat on the RV's tiny bathroom counter as if she'd just removed it for washing. The children's favorite toys were arranged on the dining table in a precise line. Emma's worn teddy bear, Tommy's red sports car, a wooden puzzle they'd been working on together. Most unsettling was the campfire. When deputies arrived Sunday morning, it had been recently extinguished, not left to burn down naturally, but deliberately doused with water or sand. The coals were cold, but analysis later determined they'd been hot within the past 36 hours. Someone had tended that fire Friday night or Saturday morning, long after the Collins family should have departed for home. The search expanded rapidly. Within 3 days, over 200 volunteers combed every trail, every creek bed, every potential shelter within a 15-mile radius. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the canopy for body heat. Rescue dogs followed scent trails that led in impossible directions. Sometimes toward the creek, sometimes up the mountain, sometimes in circles that made no logical sense. I've reviewed every search report, every interview transcript, every piece of physical evidence collected during those first frantic weeks. The official investigation generated over 3,000 pages of documentation, but reading through it feels like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. For every answer the evidence provided, it raised 2 new questions that seemed impossible to resolve. The search dogs, for instance, were some of the best in Colorado. animals trained to track human scent across difficult terrain and adverse conditions. But at Wildwood Creek they behaved erratically. Duke, a German shepherd with 6 years of successful rescue operations, would start following a trail with apparent confidence, then suddenly stop, whine, and refuse to continue. His handler, an experienced K9 officer named Robert Chen, had never seen Duke react that way. It was like the scent just vanished, Chen told me during our interview last spring. Duke would be tracking strong, tail up, totally focused, then he'd hit this invisible wall and back away. I've seen dogs lose scent trails before. Water can wash them away, wind can disperse them. But this was different. It was like Duke was afraid of something. The helicopter searches proved equally frustrating. Thermal imaging should have detected any warm-blooded creatures larger than a rabbit within the search area, but the equipment malfunctioned repeatedly over Site 7 and the immediate surrounding area. Pilots reported instrument failures, compass deviations, and radio interference that cleared up as soon as they moved away from the campground. The Federal Aviation Administration investigated these reports, but found no explanation for the technical difficulties. By October 1st, 2 weeks after the Collins family vanished, the active search was scaled back to weekends only. By November, it was suspended entirely pending new evidence. The case file was transferred to the Missing Persons Division, where it joined thousands of other unsolved disappearances that haunt law enforcement databases across the country. Part 3, 8,056 characters. But the Collins family refused to become just another statistic. Their story spread through local media, then national news, then the early internet forums where amateur detectives gathered to discuss unsolved mysteries. Sarah's sister, Julie, became the public face of the family's search, giving interviews and organizing volunteer search parties every weekend for 6 months. She offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to their discovery. Money she didn't have, borrowed against her home's equity because she couldn't accept that her sister was simply gone. I first heard about the Collins case in 2003, when I was working for a private investigation firm in Phoenix. A client mentioned it in passing, some family that had vanished while camping, probably eaten by bears or fallen into a hidden mine shaft. But something about the details nagged at me. Families don't disappear without leaving traces. Bears don't remove identification documents. Mine shafts don't explain why search dogs refuse to follow scent trails. The more I researched, the deeper the mystery became. I discovered that Wildwood Creek Campground had a history of unusual incidents dating back to the 1970s. 3 other families had vanished from the area over 30 years. Though never as completely or mysteriously as the Collins family. In 1974, the Reynolds family disappeared during a fishing trip, leaving behind their car and tackle box, but taking nothing else. They were found 6 days later, wandering naked and confused on a highway 30 miles away, with no memory of what had happened to them. In 1982, the Martinez family vanished for 18 hours during a day hike. They reappeared at their campsite with fantastic stories about underground tunnels and strange lights, claiming they'd been held captive by government scientists conducting experiments. The local sheriff dismissed their account as altitude sickness or possible drug use, but medical examinations found no evidence of either condition. Most disturbing was the 1989 disappearance of college student Kevin Walsh, who was camping alone when he apparently walked away from his tent in the middle of the night, leaving behind his wallet, keys, and a half-finished letter to his girlfriend. His body was found 3 months later in an area that had been thoroughly searched multiple times. The cause of death was listed as exposure, but the coroner noted that Kevin's body showed signs of having been moved post-mortem, though from where to where remained unexplained. These cases shared common elements that troubled me. The complete absence of the victims during search efforts, the apparent impossibility of their disappearances given the terrain and search protocols, and the local authorities' eagerness to close the cases as quickly as possible. It was as if something about Wildwood Creek discouraged thorough investigation, as if there was an unspoken agreement to accept superficial explanations rather than dig deeper into the truth. I decided to visit the campground myself in late 2003. The drive from Denver took exactly 3 hours, just as Mark Collins had calculated 2 years earlier. The campground looked smaller than I'd expected. Just 12 sites scattered along maybe half a mile of creek bed, connected by a single dirt road that ended at a parking area near the camp office. Site 7, where the Collins family had stayed, was marked only by a concrete picnic table and a metal fire ring. Pine needles had accumulated in thick drifts, and wildflowers grew through the gaps where their RV's tires had compressed the earth. Standing there in the late afternoon silence, I tried to imagine what the Collins family's final hours might have looked like. Had they gone to bed normally Thursday night, planning to wake Friday morning and hike to the waterfall Emma had written about? Had something disturbed them during the night, a sound, a light, a visitor they hadn't expected? Or had Friday passed normally, with the mystery beginning only when they failed to leave Saturday morning as planned? The waterfall Emma mentioned in her journal was about 2 miles up a moderately difficult trail that switchbacked through dense forest before opening onto a meadow where water cascaded 50 feet down granite cliffs. I hiked to it that afternoon, timing the walk carefully. It would have taken the Collins family about an hour each way, accounting for Tommy's shorter legs and frequent stops to examine interesting rocks or wildlife. They could have easily made the hike Friday morning and returned by lunch, which meant something happened to them between Friday afternoon and Saturday evening, a window of maybe 30 hours when they transitioned from living, breathing human beings to 4 of Colorado's most famous ghosts. The waterfall itself was beautiful but unremarkable, the kind of scenic destination that graces calendar photographs and screensavers. I found no evidence of human activity beyond the occasional candy wrapper or cigarette butt left by other hikers. But as I stood there listening to water pound against stone, I felt something I hadn't expected, a profound sense of being watched, not by wildlife or other hikers, but by something that couldn't be easily categorized or explained. I've spent enough time alone in wild places to recognize the difference between reasonable caution and irrational fear. This was something else entirely, a certainty that I was not alone, despite what my eyes and ears confirmed. The feeling followed me back down the trail, intensifying as I approached Site 7, finally lifting only when I reached my rental car and started the engine. That night I stayed in Aspen, in a motel room where I spread the Collins case files across the bed and tried to make sense of what I'd learned. The official investigation had been thorough within conventional parameters, but it hadn't addressed the campground's history of unusual incidents or the technical difficulties experienced during the search. It was as if the investigators had been working with deliberate blinders, focusing only on immediate evidence while ignoring broader patterns that might have provided crucial context. I made a decision that night that would define the next decade of my life. I was going to solve the Collins case, whatever it took. I had no idea that the answer would find me 12 years later in the most unexpected way possible, or that when it did, I would wish I had never started looking. Udrao Part 4, 8/892 characters. The Collins investigation consumed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I took a leave of absence from my firm, cashed out my retirement savings, and essentially moved to Colorado for 6 months. I interviewed every witness multiple times, retraced every search route, examined every piece of evidence the police would allow me to see. I became a familiar sight at the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office, where deputies would nod politely and tell me they were still following leads, though I could see in their eyes that they'd moved on to cases with better chances of resolution. Julie Collins became my closest ally in those early years. She was a thin woman with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held too much sadness, but she had her sister's determination and an encyclopedic knowledge of every detail surrounding the disappearance. Together, we organized search parties every few months, concentrating on areas the official investigation had covered less thoroughly. We examined abandoned mine shafts, explored cave systems, and followed game trails that led deeper into the wilderness than any family would reasonably venture. We found nothing. Every expedition ended the same way, with more questions and fewer answers, with growing frustration and the terrible suspicion that we were searching for something that couldn't be found through conventional methods. After 2 years of intensive effort, I had generated my own 1,000-page case file, but was no closer to understanding what had happened to Mark, Sarah, Emma, and Tommy Collins than when I'd started. In 2005, I returned to private investigation work, but the Collins case remained my obsession. I built an extensive network of contacts among law enforcement, search and rescue teams, and other private investigators across the western United States. I established Google alerts for dozens of keywords related to missing persons and unexplained disappearances. I monitored online forums where amateur detectives shared theories and information about cold cases. The internet was changing how mysteries were investigated, creating communities of researchers who could pool resources and expertise in ways that had never been possible before. The Collins case attracted particular attention on sites like Reddit and Above Top Secret, spawning elaborate theories about everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups to dimensional portals hidden in the Colorado mountains. Most of these theories were ridiculous, but they kept the case in public consciousness and occasionally produced genuinely useful leads. One of the most persistent theories involved the proximity of Wildwood Creek to several military installations and classified research facilities. Conspiracy theorists noted that the campground was less than 50 miles from Cheyenne Mountain, home to NORAD's command center, and suggested that the Collins family might have witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. This theory gained traction after a former military contractor claimed online that he'd worked on dimensional research projects in the Colorado mountains during the 1990s, though he provided no evidence to support his assertions. Another popular theory focused on the area's geological features. Colorado is honeycomb with caves, abandoned mines, and underground water systems that can appear and disappear seasonally. Perhaps the Collins family had fallen into some previously unknown cavern or been trapped by a cave-in that sealed them underground. This explanation had the virtue of being scientifically plausible, though extensive, ground-penetrating radar surveys had found no evidence of substantial underground voids in the immediate area. The most disturbing theory, and the one I found myself returning to despite my rational skepticism, involved human predators. What if the Collins family had encountered someone at the campground, another camper, a drifter, a local with intimate knowledge of the terrain? What if they'd been kidnapped, murdered, and buried in some location the searchers had missed? This scenario explained the missing identification documents and the deliberately extinguished campfire, suggesting someone had tried to buy time or cover their tracks. But who could have accomplished such a perfect crime? 4 people don't disappear without a struggle, without noise, without leaving some trace for investigators to follow. The Collins family included 2 adults and a 12-year-old who were neither naive nor helpless. Mark was an experienced outdoorsman who'd served 2 years in the Army Reserve. Sarah had taken self-defense classes after being mugged in college. Even Tommy, at 8 years old, was loud and energetic in the way that makes children naturally difficult to manage against their will. For someone to have overpowered all 4 family members and disposed of their bodies so thoroughly that extensive searches found no trace would have required extraordinary planning, local knowledge, and probably multiple accomplices. It would have been less a random crime than a military operation, which led some investigators back to the government conspiracy theories that seemed to multiply rather than resolve as time passed. By 2008, 7 years after the disappearance, the Collins case had achieved that peculiar status reserved for truly puzzling mysteries. It was simultaneously famous and forgotten, discussed extensively online, but no longer actively investigated by official authorities. Julie Collins still organized annual memorial searches, but attendance had dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers and true crime enthusiasts. The reward money had been spent on private investigators and search expenses. The case had joined the ranks of America's most enduring mysteries, along with D.B. Cooper and the Zodiac Killer and all the other puzzles that capture public imagination precisely because they resist easy solutions. I continued following leads when they emerged, but my active investigation had evolved into something more like monitoring, staying alert for developments while accepting that breakthrough discoveries were unlikely after so many years. I'd established a reputation as the leading unofficial expert on the Collins case, which meant journalists and documentary producers contacted me whenever they wanted to revisit the story. I appeared in 3 television specials and countless podcast episodes, always ending with the same frustrating conclusion. We simply didn't know what had happened to this family. The case taught me humility about the limits of investigation and human knowledge. Some mysteries resist solution, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the truth exceeds our ability to comprehend it. The Collins family vanished as completely as if they'd never existed, leaving behind only questions and the terrible certainty that something had gone wrong in those Colorado mountains that our conventional understanding of reality couldn't explain. Part 5, 8 to 967 characters. The break in the Collins case came from the most unlikely source imaginable, a reality television show about house flipping. In March 2013, 12 years after the family's disappearance, a production company was filming an episode about renovating a foreclosed home in suburbs of Colorado Springs. The house had been abandoned for 3 years following the owner's death, and the renovation crew was documenting the extensive damage caused by weather and neglect. The homeowner was Margaret Chen, the same Robert Chen whose search dog Duke had behaved so strangely at Wildwood Creek in 2001. Robert had died of cancer in 2010, leaving his widow with a property she couldn't afford to maintain. The television producers had purchased the house for $20,000, planning to demonstrate how even severely damaged properties could be restored with sufficient effort and investment. The renovation crew was led by Jake Morrison, a carpenter with 15 years of experience in historic restoration. Jake was methodical and careful, the kind of craftsman who documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. When the cameras weren't rolling, he worked alone, taking time to understand how the house had been constructed and what repairs would be necessary to bring it back to livable condition. On March 15th, Jake was working in the master bedroom, removing water-damaged drywall to assess the extent of mold growth behind the walls. The room faced east, with 2 large windows that had been boarded up to prevent vandalism. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the plywood, creating dramatic patterns of light and shadow that the television producers loved to capture in their establishing shots. Jake had removed about 6 feet of drywall when he noticed something unusual in the wall cavity. Insulation had been disturbed in a small area, pulled aside to create a hiding place about the size of a shoebox. Inside this improvised cache, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags, was a child's tennis shoe, pink and white, size 6, with Emma written in black marker on the inside tongue. Jake Morrison had never heard of the Collins family. He had no idea that he was holding evidence from one of Colorado's most famous unsolved cases. To him, it was just an old sneaker that someone had hidden in the wall for unknown reasons. Maybe a childhood memento, maybe something a previous owner had stored and forgotten. He photographed the shoe in place, then removed it and set it aside while he continued working. It was Margaret Chen who recognized the significance of the discovery. She visited the renovation site that afternoon to check on the crew's progress, and Jake showed her the various items he'd found hidden in the walls. Old newspapers, a few coins, and the pink tennis shoe with a child's name written inside. Margaret had lived with the Collins case for 12 years, listening to her late husband discuss it over dinner, reading every news article, following every development in the investigation. "Emma Collins," she whispered, and Jake Morrison's blood turned to ice water. Margaret called the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office immediately. Within 2 hours, Detective Linda Torres had driven the 150 miles from Aspen to Colorado Springs, accompanied by an evidence technician and a photographer. The house was treated as a crime scene, with the renovation crew asked to stop work, while investigators processed Jake's discovery and searched for additional evidence. The tennis shoe was definitely Emma's. Sarah Collins had written her daughter's name in all her shoes, a habit developed after Emma lost her favorite sneakers at a school playground in 3rd grade. Julie Collins confirmed the handwriting, and dental impressions on the shoelaces matched Emma's bite patterns from when she'd nervously chewed on them during violin practice. DNA testing later confirmed what everyone already knew. This shoe had belonged to 12-year-old Emma Collins. But how had it traveled from Wildwood Creek Campground to a suburban house in Colorado Springs? And why was only one shoe hidden in the wall? The second shoe was never found, despite extensive searches of the house and property. Investigators tore apart every room, examined every wall cavity, dug up the entire backyard. They found old newspapers, forgotten tools, a few children's toys from previous owners, but nothing else connected to the Collins family. The house's ownership history provided no obvious links to the case. Robert and Margaret Chen had purchased it in 1995 from a retired couple who'd lived there for 30 years. Before that, it had been owned by a single family since its construction in 1962. None of these owners had any apparent connection to Wildwood Creek or the missing Collins family. Property records, tax documents, and neighbor interviews revealed nothing that explained how Emma's shoe had arrived in that wall cavity. Detective Torres interviewed Jake Morrison extensively. He seemed genuinely shocked by the discovery and cooperated fully with the investigation. His background check revealed no criminal history, no connections to the Collins case, no reason to suspect he'd planted evidence for publicity or personal gain. The television production company's footage confirmed his account of finding the shoe, ruling out the possibility that he'd brought it to the site himself. The renovation crew had been working systematically through the house for 2 weeks before finding Emma's shoe. They documented their progress extensively, creating a detailed record of which walls had been opened and when. The shoe had definitely been in the wall cavity for an extended period. The plastic bags were brittle with age, and dust patterns suggested the insulation had been undisturbed for years. Margaret Chen provided investigators with detailed information about her late husband's involvement in the Collins search. Robert had been deeply affected by the case, particularly by Duke's unusual behavior at the campground. He'd continued following developments even after retiring from search and rescue work, discussing new theories with Margaret and expressing frustration that such a complete disappearance was possible in the modern era. He never got over that case, Margaret told Detective Torres. Robert was a logical man, very methodical, but the Collins disappearance challenged everything he believed about how the world worked. He used to say it was like they'd been erased from reality itself. The discovery of Emma's shoe generated immediate media attention. Within hours, news vans lined the street outside the Chen house, and reporters from across the country descended on Colorado Springs. The Collins case was front-page news again, with talking heads debating what the shoe meant and whether it represented a genuine breakthrough or just another tantalizing clue that would lead nowhere. Julie Collins flew to Colorado Springs immediately, clutching a photograph of Emma wearing those same pink and white tennis shoes during a family barbecue the summer before their final camping trip. Seeing the shoe again after 12 years reduced her to tears, but it also renewed her hope that other evidence might exist somewhere, hidden in places no one had thought to look. Part 6. 8,834 characters. The media frenzy surrounding Emma's tennis shoe lasted for weeks, generating hundreds of tips from people across the country who claimed to have information about the Collins case. Most of these tips proved worthless. The usual collection of psychics, attention seekers, and well-meaning individuals whose memories had been distorted by time and wishful thinking. But a few tips led to genuine discoveries that expanded the mystery rather than resolving it. A woman in Utah contacted investigators after seeing news coverage of the shoe discovery. She claimed that her late father, a long-haul trucker, had mentioned finding children's clothing scattered along a remote highway in 2001. The clothing had been turned over to local authorities, but no missing persons reports matched the items at the time. The woman had kept her father's logbooks, which showed he'd been driving through Colorado during the week the Collins family disappeared. Investigators tracked down the clothing through evidence databases and found two items that caught their attention. A small boy's t-shirt with a dinosaur print that matched Tommy Collins's description of his favorite shirt, and a hair tie with distinctive beads that Sarah Collins had been wearing in her last photograph. Like Emma's shoe, these items raised more questions than they answered. How had the family's belongings become scattered across hundreds of miles? Why were they found individually rather than together? Another tip came from a construction worker in Montana who'd found a wallet wedged in a bridge support beam during a repair project in 2009. The wallet contained Mark Collins's driver's license and credit cards, but no cash or family photographs. The bridge was 800 miles from Wildwood Creek, on a highway the Collins family had never traveled. The construction worker had turned the wallet over to local police, who'd held it as unclaimed property for 4 years, before destroying it according to standard procedures. These discoveries created a pattern that investigators couldn't explain. Collins family belongings appearing in random locations across the western United States, always found years after their disappearance, always without context or additional evidence. It was as if someone had deliberately scattered their possessions across thousands of square miles, creating false trails that led nowhere meaningful. Detective Torres assembled a task force to investigate these new leads, but the more evidence they found, the more confusing the case became. The items were authentic. DNA testing and family identification confirmed they'd belonged to the missing Collins family members. But their distribution made no logical sense. The geographical spread suggested either an impossibly elaborate cover-up or some phenomenon that exceeded conventional understanding of how missing persons cases typically unfold. I became involved in the investigation again at this point, consulting with Detective Torres and sharing my decade of research into the case. The discovery of Emma's shoe had vindicated my belief that answers existed somewhere, but it had also forced me to confront possibilities I'd been reluctant to consider. What if the Collins family had encountered something at Wildwood Creek that couldn't be explained through conventional criminal investigation? The house where Emma's shoe was found became the focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators used ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, and acoustic sensors to search for hidden compartments or buried evidence. They interviewed every person who'd lived in the neighborhood for the past 20 years, looking for anyone who might have had access to the property and motive to hide evidence there. One interview proved particularly interesting. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, an 87-year-old widow who lived next door, remembered a man who'd done odd jobs around the neighborhood in the early 2000s. He'd appeared shortly after the Collins disappearance, claiming to be a veteran down on his luck who was willing to work for food and small amounts of cash. Several neighbors had hired him for yard work and minor repairs. He was polite enough, Mrs. Walsh told investigators. Quiet, kept to himself, but there was something about him that made me uncomfortable. He knew things about people, where they worked, when they'd be away from home, personal details they hadn't shared with him. And he was always asking about empty houses, foreclosures, places where no one was living. Mrs. Walsh couldn't remember the man's name, but she described him as medium height and build, probably in his 40s, with prematurely grey hair and hands that showed evidence of manual labour. He'd worked on the Chen property several times, she recalled, always when Robert was away on search and rescue missions. The timing suggested he might have had access to the house during the period when Emma's shoe was hidden in the wall. Investigators created a composite sketch based on Mrs. Walsh's description and circulated it through law enforcement databases. They also checked employment records, contractor licenses, and vagrant arrest reports from the Colorado Springs area during 2001 and 2002. But they found no matches. The mysterious handyman seemed to have appeared and disappeared without leaving official traces of his existence. This pattern repeated itself as investigators followed other leads connected to the scattered Collins family belongings. Witnesses remembered strangers who'd been in their areas around the time evidence was discovered. A drifter here, a contractor there, always someone who fit the general description but left no verifiable records of their identity or whereabouts. The investigation expanded to include behavioral analysts and criminal profilers who specialized in unusual cases. They developed a theory that the Collins family had encountered an organized group rather than a single perpetrator, perhaps a network of individuals who specialized in making people disappear for reasons that remained unclear. This theory explained the geographical distribution of evidence and the sophisticated planning that would have been necessary to dispose of 4 bodies so completely. But even this expanded explanation left crucial questions unanswered. What motive would drive such an elaborate conspiracy? How could a criminal network operate for decades without leaving more substantial evidence of their activities? And why scatter the victims' belongings in ways that were guaranteed to eventually attract law enforcement attention? As the investigation progressed through 2013, I found myself returning repeatedly to Robert Chen's involvement in the original search. Here was a man who'd experienced the mystery firsthand, whose search dog had behaved inexplicably at the campground, who'd been deeply affected by the case's unsolved nature. After his death, evidence from the case appeared in his home, hidden in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of both the property and the investigation. Could Robert Chen have known more about the Collins disappearance than he'd ever admitted? Had he hidden Emma's shoe in his own house for reasons we couldn't understand? Or was his connection to the discovery simply another example of the case's tendency to generate coincidences that seemed meaningful but led nowhere productive? The more I learned about the case, the more convinced I became that conventional investigation methods were insufficient to solve it. The Collins family hadn't just disappeared. They'd entered some twilight zone where normal rules of evidence and logic seemed suspended. Finding Emma's shoe hadn't brought us closer to answers. It had only confirmed that this mystery operated according to principles we didn't understand. Part 7. 8,756 characters. By late 2013, the renewed investigation into the Collins case had generated significant media attention, but little progress toward actual resolution. Detective Torres's task force had followed hundreds of leads, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and analyzed evidence from across the western United States. They'd established that Collins' family belongings had indeed been scattered over vast distances, but they were no closer to understanding how or why this had happened. The case file had grown to over 5,000 pages, including forensic reports, witness statements, geographic analyses, and behavioral profiles. Yet for all this documentation, the central mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. 4 people had vanished completely from a small campground in Colorado, leaving behind only scattered possessions that appeared years later in seemingly random locations. I continued consulting on the investigation while returning to other cases, but the Collins mystery had become my white whale. The case that had defined my career and consumed more time and resources than any rational cost-benefit analysis could justify. I'd spent 12 years developing expertise in a mystery that seemed designed to resist solution, creating detailed knowledge about a puzzle that might be fundamentally unsolvable. The media attention gradually faded as other stories captured public interest. True crime podcasts still discuss the case occasionally, usually as part of series about America's most baffling disappearances. Online forums continued to generate theories and debate evidence, but the discussions had become circular, rehashing the same questions and possibilities without generating new insights. Julie Collins aged visibly during this period, transforming from a determined woman seeking her sister's family into someone haunted by unanswered questions and false hopes. The discovery of Emma's shoe had temporarily renewed her optimism, but as months passed without additional breakthroughs, that hope curdled into something closer to despair. She'd spent 12 years organizing searches, offering rewards, and maintaining public attention for a case that seemed to mock every effort at resolution. In 2014, Julie made a decision that surprised everyone who'd followed the case. She stopped her active involvement in the investigation. She cancelled the annual memorial searches, took down the family website, and retreated from public discussions about her sister's disappearance. In a brief statement to local media, she explained that she needed to accept the possibility that some questions don't have answers in this lifetime. Her withdrawal from the case felt like an ending, though not the resolution anyone had hoped for. The Collins family had finally defeated even their most dedicated advocate, forcing acceptance of what investigators had long suspected, that some mysteries are simply too complex for human understanding to unravel. The official investigation was scaled back again in early 2015. Detective Torres retired, and her replacement showed little interest in pursuing leads that had proven fruitless for over a decade. The case remained officially open, but active investigations ceased except when new evidence emerged, which happened rarely and never led to meaningful progress. I found myself in a strange position during this period. I'd become the unofficial curator of the Collins mystery, the person journalists contacted when they wanted expert commentary on disappearance cases or unsolved mysteries. My reputation was built on a case I couldn't solve, expertise in a mystery that remained as baffling in 2015 as it had been in 2001, but I couldn't abandon the case entirely. Something about the Collins family's disappearance continued to nag at me, a sense that I was missing some crucial piece of information that would make everything else make sense. I'd invested too much of my life in the mystery to simply walk away, even though rational analysis suggested that further investigation was unlikely to produce results. I established a more systematic approach to monitoring the case, setting up automated searches for Collins-related content across news databases, social media platforms, and law enforcement bulletins. I maintained contact with key investigators and witnesses, checking in periodically to see if they'd remembered additional details or developed new theories. I created detailed maps showing where Collins' family belongings had been discovered, looking for patterns that might have been missed during the active investigation. The maps were particularly intriguing. The discovery locations seemed random at first glance, but closer analysis revealed subtle patterns that suggested either careful planning or some underlying logic that wasn't immediately apparent. Items belonging to different family members had been found in different regions. Emma's shoe in Colorado Springs, Tommy's shirt in Utah, Mark's wallet in Montana, Sarah's hair tie in Wyoming. The distribution created a rough circle with Wildwood Creek at its approximate center, as if someone had traveled in expanding spirals while disposing of evidence. This geographical pattern became my new obsession. I spent months analyzing road networks, travel times, and population centers within the circle defined by discovery locations. I looked for connections between the people who'd found Collins' belongings, searching for common threads that might explain how the evidence had reached such scattered locations. I found no definitive connections, but several interesting coincidences emerged. 3 of the people who discovered Collins' items had military backgrounds. 2 had worked in construction or renovation. 4 had moved to their current locations within 5 years of finding the evidence. These patterns could have been meaningless. Military service and construction work are common backgrounds, and people move frequently for various reasons. But after 12 years of investigating a case built on impossible coincidences, I'd learned to pay attention to any recurring elements. The case had taught me that impossibility was relative. Events that seemed impossible from one perspective might be perfectly logical when viewed through a different lens. The Collins family's disappearance challenged basic assumptions about how missing persons cases unfold. But that didn't necessarily mean supernatural forces were involved. It might simply mean that conventional investigation methods were inadequate for understanding what had actually occurred. This realization led me to explore alternative approaches to the case. I consulted with experts in fields outside traditional law enforcement, anthropologists who studied ritual behavior, psychologists who specialized in memory and perception, even physicists who researched quantum mechanics and parallel dimensions. Most of these consultations proved fruitless, but they helped me develop a more flexible understanding of what might be possible in cases like this. By 2016, 15 years after the Collins family's disappearance, I'd reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The case might never be solved through conventional means. But that didn't mean I should stop looking for answers. It meant I needed to be prepared for discoveries that challenged everything I thought I knew about how reality worked. Part 8, 8,945 characters. The second major breakthrough in the Collins case came in September 2017, exactly 16 years after the family's disappearance. This time, the discovery wasn't made by construction workers or highway maintenance crews, but by a team of urban explorers investigating abandoned buildings in downtown Denver. Urban exploration, or urbex as practitioners call it, involves entering abandoned structures to photograph decay and document forgotten history. It's technically illegal in most cases, which means urbex enthusiasts rarely report their discoveries to authorities. But what they found in the basement of a condemned office building was impossible to ignore. A room that contained personal items from all 4 missing Collins family members, arranged as if someone had created a shrine to their memory. The building had been vacant since 2010, when the last business tenant moved out rather than pay for expensive structural repairs. The property sat in legal limbo while developers and the city argued over demolition permits and environmental cleanup requirements. During this period, the building became a magnet for graffiti artists, homeless encampments, and urbex photographers who documented its gradual decay. Marcus Webb and Sarah Kim were experienced urban explorers with thousands of followers on social media who documented their expeditions through abandoned hospitals, factories, and office buildings. They'd been photographing the Denver building for a documentary about urban decay when they noticed a door in the basement that seemed newer than the surrounding architecture. The door was heavy steel with multiple locks, but age and neglect had warped the frame enough to create a gap they could squeeze through. Inside, they found a room approximately 10 feet square, with concrete walls and no windows. The space had been carefully maintained, despite the building's abandonment. No dust, no debris, no signs of vandalism or weather damage. A small, battery-powered lantern provided illumination, and the walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and maps related to the Collins case. But the centerpiece of the room was a display table containing personal items that clearly belonged to the missing family. Mark's reading glasses sat beside Sarah's favorite coffee mug. Emma's violin music was spread across a music stand, with pencil marks showing where she'd been practicing difficult passages. Tommy's collection of toy cars was arranged in precise rows, each vehicle carefully positioned as if for inspection. Marcus and Sarah photographed everything before contacting authorities, understanding that they might face trespassing charges, but knowing the discovery was too important to hide. Their photographs showed a level of organization that suggested obsessive attention to detail. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this display, maintaining it regularly, and protecting it from the building's deteriorating conditions. Detective Ramon Martinez, who'd inherited the Collins case after Torres's retirement, responded to the scene within hours. The room was processed as carefully as any crime scene, with each item photographed in place before being collected as evidence. The space yielded dozens of fingerprints, but none matched any individuals in law enforcement databases. DNA testing found hair and skin cells from multiple people, but again, no matches in existing files. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was how recently the room had been maintained. The battery in the lantern was fresh, replaced within the past few weeks. The photographs on the walls included recent newspaper clippings about the case, including coverage of Emma's shoe discovery in 2013. Someone had been regularly visiting this room, updating the display with new information, maintaining their shrine to the Collins family years after public interest in the case had faded. Building security records were minimal. The property had changed hands multiple times during its abandonment, and different companies had provided intermittent security services. No one could explain how someone had gained regular access to the basement without detection, or how they'd installed the heavy steel door without attracting attention. The room appeared to have been constructed sometime between 2010 and 2012, based on the dates of the oldest newspaper clippings on the walls. Investigators expanded their search to include the entire building, looking for additional evidence or signs of long-term occupation. They found camping equipment on the third floor, suggesting someone had been living in the building periodically, but no clear connection to the basement room. The camping gear yielded more DNA samples, but again, no matches in existing databases. The discovery generated immediate media attention, bringing the Collins case back into national headlines after years of relative quiet. Julie Collins, who'd avoided publicity since 2014, agreed to identify the items found in the room. The experience of seeing her sister's possessions displayed like museum artifacts was devastating. She confirmed the authenticity of multiple items while struggling to understand what kind of person would create such a memorial. "It's like someone who knew them intimately," she told reporters. "These aren't just random belongings. They're meaningful objects, things that defined who they were as people. Emma's music, with her own notations. Tommy's cars, arranged exactly how he always kept them. Whoever did this understood my sister's family in ways that seem impossible for a stranger." This observation became central to the renewed investigation. The level of detail in the room suggested either someone who'd known the Collins family personally or someone who'd studied them obsessively for years. But interviews with family friends, neighbors, and colleagues revealed no one who fit this profile. The Collins family had been well liked, but not close to many people outside their immediate circle, and none of their acquaintances had ever shown unusual interest in their personal belongings or private lives. The basement room also contained items that had never been publicly reported as missing. Sarah's reading journal with personal notes about books she'd enjoyed, Mark's collection of guitar picks from concerts he'd attended, Emma's diary entries about school friends and childhood crushes. These intimate details suggested access to the family's home or extremely close observation of their daily lives before the disappearance. Investigators re-examined the Collins family's routine during the months before their final camping trip, looking for signs of surveillance or stalking behavior they might have missed during the original investigation. They interviewed neighbors again, checked social media accounts that hadn't existed in 2001, and analyzed phone records that had been preserved in digital archives. They found no evidence that the family had been targeted or monitored before their disappearance. The basement room represented a new category of evidence that investigators struggled to classify. It wasn't exactly a crime scene. No violence had occurred there, and its existence didn't directly explain what had happened to the Collins family. But it proved that someone with detailed knowledge of the case had remained actively involved for over a decade, maintaining an elaborate shrine while successfully avoiding detection by law enforcement. This discovery changed my understanding of the case fundamentally. For 16 years, I'd assumed the Collins family had encountered either random violence or an organized criminal group operating in the Colorado mountains. But the basement room suggested something far more personal and psychologically complex, a long-term obsession that combined intimate knowledge of the victims with sophisticated planning and execution. Whoever had created that room wasn't just hiding evidence or covering up a crime. They were commemorating the Collins family, preserving their memory with a level of care that suggested genuine affection or respect. This emotional component added new dimensions to the mystery that were even more difficult to understand than the original disappearance itself. Andres, Part 9, 1891 characters. The investigation into the basement shrine opened new avenues of inquiry that investigators had never considered during the original case. For the first time in 16 years, law enforcement had evidence of someone who'd maintained active involvement with the Collins disappearance over an extended period. This person had resources, knowledge, and motivation that set them apart from typical suspects in missing persons cases. Detective Martinez assembled a new task force that included FBI behavioral analysts, specializing in obsessive disorders and long-term stalking behaviors. They developed a profile of someone who'd likely been following the Collins case from its beginning, possibly even before the family's disappearance. This individual had access to personal items that weren't part of the official evidence inventory, suggesting either direct involvement in the original incident or subsequent contact with someone who'd been there. The psychological profile painted a picture of someone highly organized and methodical, capable of maintaining secrets for decades while living what appeared to be a normal life. The care taken in preserving and displaying the Collins family belongings suggested genuine emotional attachment rather than clinical detachment. This person wasn't just hiding evidence. They were creating a memorial that honored the memory of people they'd apparently cared about. This emotional dimension complicated traditional criminal investigation approaches. If the person responsible for the shrine had actually harmed the Collins family, why commemorate them so lovingly? If they'd been innocent witnesses to someone else's crime, why maintain secrecy instead of cooperating with authorities? The basement room raised questions about motivation that standard criminal psychology couldn't easily answer. I spent months analyzing every detail of the room through photographs and evidence reports. The arrangement of objects showed patterns that suggested ritual behavior. Items were positioned according to some internal logic that wasn't immediately apparent, but felt deliberate and meaningful. The photographs on the walls were organized chronologically, creating a timeline of the case's development from the initial disappearance through various discoveries of evidence. But the most intriguing aspect of the room was what it didn't contain. Despite the obviously obsessive nature of the collection, there were no photographs of the Collins family themselves, no personal letters or documents that would have revealed intimate details about their relationships or private thoughts. The displayed items were meaningful but not invasive. Someone had created a memorial that honored the family without violating their privacy in death. This restraint suggested either deep respect for the victims or careful calculation about what evidence to preserve. Someone with criminal intent might have been more careless about collecting personal materials, while someone with genuine affection might have been more selective about what felt appropriate to display. The basement room fell somewhere between these extremes, creating a psychological profile that defied easy categorization. The building's ownership history became crucial to understanding who might have had access to create the room. Property records showed the building had been purchased by a development company in 2009, shortly before the last business tenant moved out. The development company was owned by a consortium of investors that included several Colorado-based real estate firms, but tracking down individual investors proved challenging due to complex corporate structures designed to minimize tax liability. One name that emerged from this investigation was particularly interesting: David Walsh, a retired construction contractor who'd invested in several Denver area properties during the economic downturn of 2008-2009. Walsh had extensive experience in renovation and construction, skills that would have been necessary to install the steel door and modify the basement space without attracting attention. He also lived in Colorado Springs, less than 5 miles from where Emma's tennis shoe had been discovered. When investigators interviewed Walsh in early 2018, he seemed genuinely surprised by their questions about the Collins case. He confirmed his investment in the Denver building, but claimed he'd never visited the property personally, relying on property management companies to handle maintenance and security. He had alibis for several key dates in the investigation and seemed to have no connection to the missing family beyond geographical proximity. But background checks revealed one intriguing detail. David Walsh was the older brother of Kevin Walsh, the college student who disappeared from Wildwood Creek Campground in 1989 and been found dead 3 months later under mysterious circumstances. This connection to the campground's history of unusual incidents couldn't be ignored, even though it had occurred 12 years before the Collins family's disappearance. David Walsh agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, providing DNA samples and allowing searches of his properties. He seemed genuinely interested in helping solve the case, particularly after learning about the basement room and its contents. During extended interviews, he revealed details about his brother's disappearance that hadn't been included in official reports. Kevin had been working on a geology project that required camping alone in remote areas, and he'd mentioned strange encounters with other campers who seemed to be monitoring his activities. Kevin was paranoid during those last few months, David told investigators. He thought someone was following him, watching his research sites. I figured it was just stress from school, but maybe he was right about being watched. Maybe whoever killed him was still operating in that area when the Collins family went camping. This theory suggested a long-term predator who'd been active around Wildwood Creek for decades, possibly targeting families or individuals who fit specific criteria. The geographical spread of Collins family belongings could represent this person's territory or operational area, while the basement room might be where they processed their obsessions between incidents. But this explanation still didn't account for the emotional care shown in preserving and displaying the Collins family items. Psychopathic predators don't typically create loving memorials to their victims, and the basement room showed none of the trophy-keeping behavior associated with serial crimes. If anything, it resembled a grief response. Someone mourning the Collins family's loss while being unable or unwilling to reveal what they knew about it. The investigation continued through 2018 and into 2019, generating hundreds of additional leads, but no definitive answers. The Collins case had evolved from a missing persons investigation into something more complex, a study of how mysteries perpetuate themselves, creating ripple effects that influence people's lives years after the original incident. I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I knew about the case. After 17 years of investigation, I'd accumulated enormous amounts of information about the Collins family's disappearance, but understanding remained elusive. Each new discovery raised more questions than it answered, creating layers of complexity that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The basement room forced me to confront the possibility that solving the Collins case might require accepting explanations that challenged conventional logic. Someone had maintained detailed knowledge of the investigation for nearly 2 decades while successfully avoiding detection by law enforcement. They'd created a memorial that demonstrated both intimate familiarity with the victims and sophisticated operational security. They'd scattered evidence across multiple states while leaving no verifiable traces of their identity or methods. Such capabilities suggested either extraordinary criminal sophistication or access to resources and information that exceeded what typical individuals could command. The Collins case had always seemed to operate according to rules that differed from normal missing persons investigations, but the basement room made these differences impossible to ignore. Part 10, 867 characters. In November 2019, 18 years after the Collins family vanished from Wildwood Creek Campground, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I understood about the case. The caller was Margaret Chen, Robert Chen's widow, who'd found something while cleaning out her late husband's office that she thought I should see immediately. Margaret had been gradually going through Robert's papers since his death in 2010, but his office had been too painful to tackle until she decided to sell the house where Emma's tennis shoe was discovered. While boxing up his search and rescue files, she'd found a sealed envelope hidden behind a filing cabinet, marked with Robert's handwriting. Collins case, personal notes, to be opened only in emergency. Inside the envelope was a detailed journal documenting Robert's involvement in the Collins search, but it contained information that had never been included in official reports. According to these notes, Robert's search dog Duke hadn't just behaved strangely at the campground. He'd led Robert to a specific location where they'd found evidence that Robert had decided to conceal from other investigators. The evidence was a small digital camera that had belonged to Emma Collins. The camera contained dozens of photographs taken during the family's final camping trip, including images that documented their last known activities. But it also contained something that had terrified Robert so deeply that he'd hidden it for 18 years. Photographs of people watching the Collins family from the woods around their campsite. Robert's journal described these photographs in detail. The watchers appeared to be dressed in normal camping gear, but they'd positioned themselves carefully to observe the Collins family without being detected. The photos showed the same individuals returning repeatedly over several days, suggesting organized surveillance rather than casual interest from other campers. Most disturbing were the final photographs, taken apparently by Emma on the morning of September 14th, which showed these watchers approaching the Collins campsite just before the camera's memory card ran out. According to Robert's notes, he'd recognized one of the watchers from missing persons cases he'd worked on during the 1990s. The man matched descriptions from multiple witness statements about suspicious individuals seen near campgrounds before families disappeared. Robert had realized he was looking at evidence of a predatory group that had been operating in Colorado's wilderness areas for decades, targeting families who fit specific profiles for reasons that remained unclear. But instead of reporting his discovery, Robert had made a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life. He'd concealed the camera and its contents to protect his own family from potential retaliation. His journal revealed his belief that law enforcement had been infiltrated by individuals connected to the watchers, making it dangerous to trust official channels with such sensitive evidence. "I know this makes me complicit in whatever happened to the Collins family," Robert had written. "But I also know that revealing this information would put Margaret and our children at risk. These people have been operating for 30 years without being caught. They have resources and connections that exceed anything local law enforcement can handle. The only way to protect the people I love is to pretend this evidence doesn't exist." Margaret Chen's hands were shaking as she showed me photocopies of the journal pages. She'd found the actual camera hidden in Robert's workshop, wrapped in waterproof materials and stored inside a toolbox he'd told her never to open. The camera's battery had died years ago, but the memory card still contained the photographs Robert had described. I examined the images on Margaret's computer, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears about the Collins case. The watchers weren't random criminals or opportunistic predators. They were part of an organized group with sophisticated surveillance capabilities and operational discipline. They'd monitored the Collins family for days before making their move, documenting the family's routines and identifying the optimal moment to strike. The final photographs were particularly chilling. They showed figures in camping gear approaching the Collins campsite in the early morning darkness, moving with military precision through terrain they obviously knew well. Emma had apparently awakened and grabbed her camera when she heard unusual sounds outside the family's tent, managing to take several shots before the camera's storage filled up completely. These photographs explained so much about the case that had puzzled investigators for 18 years. The Collins family hadn't vanished mysteriously. They'd been taken by an organized group with extensive experience in making people disappear. The scattered belongings found across multiple states represented deliberate misdirection, designed to confuse law enforcement and prevent focused investigation of the actual perpetrators. But the photographs also raised new questions that were even more disturbing than the original mystery. Who were these watchers? And how had they operated undetected for so long? How many other families had they targeted over the decades? And why had Robert Chen's concerns about law enforcement infiltration been serious enough to make him hide evidence rather than trust his colleagues? I spent the next several months carefully investigating Robert's claims about corruption within Colorado law enforcement. Using public records requests, journalist contacts, and private investigation techniques, I found patterns of unusual behavior around several missing persons cases that had occurred in wilderness areas during the 1990s and 2000s. Evidence had been mishandled, witnesses had been discouraged from providing statements, and investigations had been closed prematurely despite obvious unresolved questions. The pattern suggested either systematic incompetence or deliberate obstruction, but distinguishing between these possibilities required access to information that wasn't publicly available. I needed to find someone within law enforcement who was both trustworthy and positioned to access sensitive files from multiple jurisdictions across several decades. That person turned out to be Detective Martinez, who'd been quietly conducting his own investigation into irregularities surrounding the Collins case and related disappearances. He'd noticed discrepancies in evidence handling, communication gaps between agencies, and administrative decisions that seemed designed to limit rather than expand the scope of various investigations. When I shared Robert Chen's photographs with Martinez in early 2020, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The Collins case was part of something much larger than a single family's disappearance. The watchers Emma had photographed were connected to a network that had been operating across the western United States for at least 30 years, targeting families who met specific criteria and making them vanish with efficiency that suggested professional training and extensive resources. Martinez had been building a case file on this network for 2 years, working quietly to avoid alerting anyone who might be compromised within law enforcement. He'd identified at least 12 missing persons cases that showed similar patterns of organized surveillance, followed by complete disappearance. In each case, evidence had been found years later in seemingly random locations, creating false trails that led away from the actual perpetrators. The Collins family walked into something they couldn't have understood or anticipated, Martinez told me. They became victims of an operation that's been perfecting its methods for decades. The miracle isn't that they disappeared, it's that we finally have evidence of who took them and how. But even with this evidence, bringing the perpetrators to justice seemed almost impossible. The network had survived for 30 years by maintaining operational security that exceeded most criminal organizations. They'd embedded themselves within legitimate institutions, corrupted investigative processes, and created enough confusion around their activities to avoid focused law enforcement attention. The photographs from Emma's camera gave us faces and methods, but translating that information into arrests and prosecutions would require resources and coordination that exceeded what any single jurisdiction could provide. We needed federal involvement, but that meant trusting agencies that might themselves be compromised. As I write this account in 2025, 24 years after the Collins family vanished from Wildwood Creek Campground, their case remains officially unsolved. But I know what happened to them, and I know who was responsible. The basement room in Denver was created by someone connected to the network, possibly as a memorial to victims, possibly as a psychological pressure valve for operatives who struggled with the moral implications of their actions. The tennis shoe in Robert Chen's wall was placed there by someone who knew about his involvement in the search and his decision to hide evidence. It was both a message and a threat, a reminder that the network knew who had their secrets and could reach them anywhere. The Collins family died because they camped in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming targets of an organization that has made dozens of families disappear over the past 30 years. They live on in the memorial someone created for them, in the photographs their daughter took of her own killers, and in the questions their case continues to raise about how such systematic evil can operate undetected in modern America. What do you think really happened to the Collins family? Leave your theory in the comments below. But remember, some mysteries are dangerous to solve, and some truths come with costs that exceed their value. The watchers Emma photographed might still be watching, and they've proven they can reach anyone, anywhere, anytime they choose.